So, you're wondering if a Trump administration would have handled inflation and rising costs of goods and services better than the current administration or a hypothetical Kamala Harris administration. Let's dig into this, because it's a complex question with a lot of moving parts. First, let's understand what we're dealing with here. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising, and subsequently, purchasing power is falling. When it comes to inflation, several factors come into play: supply chain disruptions, energy prices, labor shortages, and global economic conditions. All of these factors have been impacting the world economy, not just the United States, since the COVID-19 pandemic. Fiscal policy differences. Under the Biden administration, we saw significant fiscal stimulus aimed at mitigating the economic fallout from the pandemic. The $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan provided direct payments to Americans, extended unemployment benefits, and allocated funds for vaccine distribution and other public health measures. Critics argue that this level of spending has contributed to inflation by increasing demand. But economists like those at the Brookings Institution point out that this stimulus was crucial for preventing a deeper recession and supporting economic recovery. On the other hand, Trump's administration also spent heavily. The CARES Act, signed by Trump in 2020, was a $2.2 trillion package that provided similar economic relief. The difference isn't necessarily in the amount spent, but in how these administrations prioritize economic relief. Both administrations opted for massive spending to combat the economic impact of the pandemic. If Trump had been re-elected, he likely would have continued a similar trajectory of fiscal stimulus, meaning we might have seen similar inflationary pressures. Tax policy and its impact on inflation. Trump's administration implemented the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which lowered corporate taxes and was aimed at stimulating business investment. While this did lead to a short-term boost in corporate profits and stock market performance, it also increased the federal deficit significantly. A study by the Congressional Budget Office showed that these tax cuts contributed to rising deficits, which can be inflationary if they lead to increased government borrowing. Biden's approach, and likely Harris's, would involve different tax policies, perhaps focusing more on increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations to fund social programs and reduce inequality. According to the Tax Policy Center, raising taxes on higher earners does not necessarily slow down economic growth or increase inflation, as long as the funds are used for productive investments. This approach could mitigate inflation by ensuring that government spending does not overly increase the deficit. Energy policy and inflation, let's dive into this. Now let's talk about energy, a key driver of inflation recently due to rising oil prices. Trump's energy policy focused heavily on deregulating fossil fuel industries and promoting energy independence by boosting domestic oil and gas production. This could have helped keep domestic energy prices lower, potentially reducing inflationary pressures related to energy. Biden, and potentially Harris, have taken a different approach, emphasizing a transition to renewable energy and addressing climate change, which includes some regulatory measures that could impact fossil fuel production. Critics argue that this transition might contribute to higher energy prices in the short term, though proponents argue it is necessary for long-term sustainability. However, energy prices are largely driven by global supply and demand factors, including geopolitical events, which any administration would have limited control over. Handling supply chain disruptions has been a significant contributor to inflation, with COVID-19 and geopolitical events causing shortages and delays. The Biden administration has taken steps to address these issues, such as coordinating with ports and logistics companies and promoting domestic manufacturing to reduce dependence on global supply chains. Trump's administration was known for its trade wars and tariffs, particularly with China. While intended to bring manufacturing back to the United States, these policies often led to increased costs for American businesses and consumers. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, tariffs generally raise prices and can exacerbate supply chain issues rather than solve them. Let's not forget the role of the Federal Reserve in managing inflation through monetary policy, such as setting interest rates. During his term, Trump frequently pressured the Fed to keep interest rates low to boost the economy. While lower rates can stimulate economic growth, they can also contribute to inflation if kept too low for too long. Biden and likely Harris have maintained a more hands-off approach with the Fed, respecting its independence. The Fed, under Chair Jerome Powell, appointed by Trump, has indicated it is willing to raise interest rates to combat inflation. This kind of decision is typically based on economic indicators rather than political influence. The truth is, economic policies have both immediate and long-term effects, and they interact with global conditions that are beyond the control of any single administration. The idea that Trump would have definitively handled inflation better than Biden, or that Harris would do better than either, is speculative at best. Both Trump and Biden have responded to unprecedented economic challenges with massive government spending to mitigate economic fallout. Their differences lie more in their broader economic philosophies and approaches to regulation and taxation. No single administration has complete control over inflation, and attributing the current situation solely to one president or another ignores the complexity of economic dynamics and external factors like global supply chains, energy prices, and even natural disasters. So, when you hear people argue that one administration would have handled things better than another, remember, it's more about specific policies and their direct impacts than a simple matter of who's in office. In conclusion, there's no concrete evidence to support the notion that a Trump administration would have handled inflation and costs better than the current administration or a potential Harris administration. Both would face similar global and domestic challenges, and their success would depend on a mix of policy decisions and external circumstances that are difficult to predict. And that's why staying informed and understanding the nuances of these policies is so crucial. So yes, you should care about politics because it's not just about who's in office, it's about the real-world impacts of their policies on our everyday lives.